So tonight we're going to explore the life of a maid, hired help, domestic worker in Nappanee. We really don't know the specifics of these people, but we found evidence of them. We know some homes had maids, but others could have had some extra hired help. And they are a piece of the puzzle of Nappanee's history that's not really talked about, but we really want to discover them and figure it out. So we'll go through like what a domestic worker is, the types, um, the servant problem that happened in the United States, and then the real Downton Abbey, because this program stemmed from my love of Downton Abbey. So we'll take a look at what domestic workers look like in the United States versus Great Britain and kind of the difference between the two also. So, there we go. What is a domestic worker? So it's a person who works within the employer's home. They perform a variety of household services for an individual or a family, providing care for their children and elderly dependents, such as housekeeping, cleaning, maintenance. Most of the workers were live-ins and often had their own quarters. They would receive room and board as part of their salaries. So they would take that out of their wages. And sometimes they would be required to wear a uniform, and that would also come out of their wages. So in Massachusetts, we know that room and board for a domestic worker was $4 a week. And in some cases, they may have slept in the kitchen or small rooms that were located in the basement or attics. But by the 1920s in the United States, they were living outside of the home. So here's some different types of servants or hired help. So you have the butler, the housekeeper, chauffeur, cook, dog walker, footman, gardener, governess or nanny, the groundskeeper, the maid or housemaid, a scullery maid, stable boy, valet, and a wet nurse. And this is kind of the hierarchy of what it would look like for servants, both in the United States and in the UK. So you have the butler is over everyone, and then it kind of stems off of that. And I forget what book this was taken out of. It might have been, because there's a really interesting book, and I can't remember what it's called, but I'm sure it will come to me. So a servant's day, and I'll go back to this. So a servant's day, so Edwardian servants in UK, their days would start at 6 a.m. and they would end by 11 p.m. So by 6:30, the butler would unlock the doors. The servants would have to eat breakfast by 8 and make sure that breakfast was served to the family by 9. The butler would have a 10 a.m. meeting with the master. Noon, the servants had to eat lunch. At 1, they would serve lunch to the family. From between 2 and 6, tea would be served, and lady maids would get ready for tea and meals. And at 5:30, the servants would eat a light meal, and then at 8 p.m., dinner was served for the family. So it's kind of the opposite of how Downton Abbey worked. The servants would eat first and then later the family. So domestic workers in the United States, most of this research comes from Chicago. So in 1870, 1 in 5 of Chicago households were employed domestic workers. They were mostly women, usually single, from working class families who stayed in service until marriage. And they didn't attract very many natural born women because of the long hours, the low status, lack of freedom, and the close supervision that was had. Most women were choosing factory over service. Servants came from the lowest ranks, either too poor to pay for housing or were excluded from other jobs. In the late 19th century, Chicago domestic workers were increasingly Irish, German, Scandinavian, and Polish women. In 1901, there was a Chicago newswoman who went undercover as a live-in servant, and she worked a tolling 15-hour hours daily and performed every household chore except for laundry, which was sent out, and she made $2.75 a week plus room and board. So her wages were $1.50 less than average, and so she compelled to the Working Women's Association of America, and this organization helped to raise wages, lower hours, and allow home visits, and established a grievance procedures. But like I said, by 1920, more workers were living at home than boarding with their employers, and by reducing the hours that the workers were available for personal service, this fostered the introduction of the labor-saving electronic appliances. And from my own experience, my great-great-grandma was a domestic servant, in which she did live with her family. But at the same time, she had my great-grandma. And in the 1900 census, my great-grandma is not included as living with my grandma or my great-great-grandma because the family chose not to disclose that they had an illegitimate child living in their house. So wages, I did an inflation calculation for, I just picked a random year of 2003. So, and I had to convert from euros to American money. But so this is the yearly wages of what a domestic worker would get in Great Britain. So it would add up, in today's money, it would add up to a total of $1,000 to $2,000 that they would be getting in a year. So here is the domestic worker wages in the United States. So it's comparing 1899 to 1939 and then translated into 2015 money. So they were still making less than average around the state. And this is actually for female domestic servants. Oh, and I should point out, in Indiana in 1939, it was $327 a year. So these are some random want ads from different newspapers. The one on the right is from Philadelphia, and they didn't want anybody who was Irish. I'm not quite sure why they didn't want an Irish woman. But then, you know, the others, the situations offered for females, they wanted a girl who could do general housework and had to be a good cook. And that's what a lot of them were wanting, was for cooking, washing, and ironing. And then here's some other ones. They wanted a clean, active girl to do housework of a private family. that they had to be a first-rate washer and ironer, a plain good cook, and kind and obligating to children. And that one also has no Irish need apply. The one below it, she had to be a Protestant. Then you have a white girl for general housework, ladies for demonstrating. So here's some more that they wanted. And then there's also one, I can't remember on which slide it is, but a lady wishes to recommend a boy, age 15, to be under a gardener in a gentleman's family, willing to be useful, and that he had 3 years of excellent character. So she was actually recommending him for a job. So workers' quarters, these pictures are taken from the Biltmore in North Carolina. It's America's largest home, and that was built by George Vanderbilt. So you can see that they're very sparse and very simple, and they most likely didn't have a lot of possessions. A great example of servant quarters in Elkhart County is at the Ruthmere in Elkhart. And I believe they actually just closed until April because they only are open from April to December. So buzzer systems, much like we see with Downton, there's the bells, which the house that was used for Downton Abbey, they couldn't film the servants' quarters because they had replaced the bells with a buzzer system. At the Ruthmere, they have the ones with the arrows that the arrow would turn to whichever room someone was buzzing from the room. And then some houses have buzzer systems. So the butler's pantry, that's actually a light. The middle picture above it is a light switch and below it is a buzzer. And so we'll talk about later some of the houses in Nappanee that had buzzers. So the servant problem in the United States. So the picture here on the bottom left is of Marshall Field's mansion in Chicago, and he was a brand new millionaire. I don't think that his mansion is standing anymore. But in 1870, he had 6 servants. 10 years later, in the census, it has a new group of 7. And by 1900, he only had 4. So evidence shows that servants quit or were dismissed far more often and probably only stayed in a residence for a year or 2 before moving on. Field staff only ever included 2 Americans, which was a 22-year-old man named David from Ohio and a groomer named Miles from Boston. The rest were either Irish, Scottish, English, Canadian, Swedish, or Norwegian. And most Americans weren't interested in working for the wealthy families. So this created the servant problem. Someone just couldn't go out and find a servant to run massive estates that were being built in America, and they were hard to find and hard to keep. The most wealthy thought to keep their status, they had to have servants, and servants were expected that they would become, or I should say, the servants expected that they would become a master in a few years' time. They were just working their way up to find something better. Working class women used domestic service as a way to launch themselves into the workplace, and immigrants used it to find their own opportunities as well. This was talked about in an 1888 article in the Chicago Tribune that says the servant problem is confessedly the most intricate in modern life. It is more intricate in the United States than in a European country. Our boasted democracy comes into the kitchen and claims for the servants' rights and the amenities never thought of in England and Germany. But it solves them in a way that we neither desire nor can make practicable. We must solve the entire problem in some other way, and that other way must include the recognition of the fact that in this country, every woman is just as good as another as long as she conducts herself virtuously. So, concluding that the servant problem wasn't a problem at all, the domestic worker and servants just didn't want to work for the U.S. in the same way that they had hoped that they would have when they visited the Mast estates in England. So that was one of the problems that was happening, was the Americans were going over to England and they were seeing these vast estates and that they were being run by these massive amounts of servants, and the servants and domestic workers were really in it for life. And in the United States, that wasn't the same thing. And in the bottom right corner is actually a picture of the Biltmore. So the real Downton Abbey. So the real Downton Abbey is Highclere Castle, and in 1912 it boasted 25 maids, 14 footmen, and 3 chefs. So that's completely different than what Mr. Marshall Fields could boast with only having 4 in 1900. Around the same time, another estate called Longleat had a steward, an under-butler, a groom of the chambers, a valet, 3 footmen, pantry boy, a hall boy, a steel boy, who his main job was polishing the silver, a housekeeper, 2 ladies' maids, 8 housemaids, 2 sewing maids, 6 laundry maids, a cook, 2 kitchen maids, a vegetable maid, a scullery maid, a dairy maid, grooms, chauffeurs, and a tiger, which that was a tiger was a small boy who lived in the livery, who rode on the coach. So the butler of Highclere, he lived for his job, the master, the family tradition, and the house itself, its history, its presence, its future as the masters they served. And the masters were known to fire a butler who took a wife on the grounds that his attention would wander. The housekeeper was the voice of the mistress, just like the butler was the eyes and ears of the master. And in the book, The Complete Servant, published in 1825, said that she was to be a steady, middle-aged woman of great experience in her profession and tolerable knowledge of the world. She had bunches of keys to every room in her house that hung on her waist. The staff actually didn't eat together in the servants' hall. The butler, housekeeper, head valet, the lady's maid, and the head housemaid would have ate elsewhere, and the lower servants learned their trade by waiting on higher servants. So the footman served the butler, and the book boy served the footman. Servants in England lived to serve and knew that this was their life. And American visitors were astonished at what they observed, especially compared with the uppity nature of the servants in the United States. So, as in Downton, when the American servants would visit, they just didn't seem to understand why the English servants wouldn't want more in their lives. And because we gave them the American dream. The Depression really finished off the way of a servant's life. When the upstairs had the folded, so did the downstairs. So now I'm going to talk about a little bit of evidence of in houses in Nappanee that could have had hired help. So the information that we've gotten on them is collected through research that we have here at the Nappanee Center and talking with current owners, past owners, and people related to the homeowners. So first up is one of my favorites. Oops. The John Coppice house. It breaks my heart every time I look at this photograph because it used to be so beautiful. It was built in the 1890s, and the third floor was finished as a maid's room, which the cistern was also on the third floor that caught the rainwater and drained to the basement. There was a pump water, or they would pump water into the kitchen from the basement, and there was an elevator for wood from the basement to the kitchen. There's also a back stairs or hallway for the maids so that they wouldn't be seen. So in the Frank Coppice home, or the Victorian guest house, one of my favorite things in there is the original table that the Coppices had, which it has a buzzer on the table. So the mistress of the house would sit where the buzzer would be, so that when they're finished with dinner or wanted dinner to be served, she would hit the buzzer and they would come and serve them. They also had a maid's chambers on the third floor. One fun fact about that, I think in the year 1900, they had a artist in residence who lived on the third floor, and she was considered to be a bohemian woman because she was from Chicago and she wore rouge and smoked cigarettes. The house also had a back hallway and stairway, and from looking through census records, we could find 4 live-in maids. Their names were Sarah Evans, Sydney Rogers, Robina McKay, and Helen Hepler. And the artist in residence, she also was commissioned to paint 3 oil paintings for Mrs. Coppice's living room. So we also have the Harvey Coppice house, which there was a maid's buzzer. This house actually had a buzzer system, but it was disabled so that children wouldn't use it. And the third floor served as the maid's quarters. There's also the Richard Chapman house, or the house that the Depression built. It had a disappearing staircase so that the maid would never be seen. And they had a cleaning lady and a neighbor who lived across the street who took care of the lawn and did odd jobs for Mr. Chapman. There was also a panel in the dining room, which I've been told by the current owner is still there, that when you tapped it with the side of your fist, it would pop open, and it is believed that they would store their silverware in that small compartment. The John Hartman house. So all of these houses, except for Harvey's house so far, have been built in the 1890s. With the Hartman house, we have a butler service cabinet, and there's lots of doors and spaces that just do not make sense. And because we have the door to nowhere, and then we also have another door to nowhere. We have 2 doors to nowhere. There's the Shively house. There was a bedroom between the kitchen and garage that was supposedly a maid's room. There's the Zook house, which they had, there's the possibility of maid's quarters in this one. The Muchler house, they had their open porch enclosed so that it could be a maid's quarters, but Lamar Mutchler also switched houses with his mother, who that's the big house right beside was his mother's father and mother's house. So we can conclude that that also probably had maids' quarters. The Arthur Miller House is pretty interesting. It was built in 1923, and a lot of people have rumored it to be a part of the Underground Railroad. The house that was on the property before this house was built was built in 1875, and it was the first house to be built in Nappanee. But through extensive research, we found that the first house that was built in Nappanee was actually originally first built in New Paris, and they just took it apart and brought it here to Nappanee. This house probably has the most evidence of servants. It actually had a butler's pantry with an outside pass-through, basement living quarters with a wood-burning fireplace, and a coal chute for it. 702 East John Street had a carport converted into a maid's room with its own private bathroom. And then also at 607 East Van Buren Street, there's the possibility of maid's quarters. It had its own bathroom and separate entrance and an easy access to the kitchen. So any questions?
Sorry, I had to unmute. No, but those houses look amazing.
Yeah, they're yeah, I'm always sad about that the blue house. That one, it's the